I felt the helicopter's vibrations through my boots as we descended toward the white expanse below. Antarctica, in February 1997, was a blinding sheet of ice stretching to the horizon, broken only by the gray smudge of Research Station Echo 7 growing larger through the frosted window. My teammates sat across from me in the cramped cabin, each lost in their own thoughts. Harrison Lane cleaned his standard-issue sidearm for the third time since takeoff, his movements precise and familiar. George Thornton tapped away at a small tablet, probably running through equipment diagnostics. Matthew Griffin stared out the window, unusually quiet without his typical jokes. Cooper Fitzgerald sat beside me, eyes closed but clearly awake, his breathing too measured for sleep. We'd worked together in Delta Unit 7 for 3 years now. 3 years of classified missions, tight spots, and the kind of trust that forms when your life depends on the man next to you. But something about this deployment felt off. Colonel Nelson's briefing had been unusually brief. Temporary security detail at Research Station Echo 7, standard perimeter monitoring and facility protection, 2 weeks maximum. When Harrison asked about potential threats, Nelson had simply said, "Likely none. Consider it a working vacation, gentlemen." Then he'd closed his folder and walked out. The helicopter dropped sharply, and my stomach lurched. The pilot's voice crackled through our headsets. 5 minutes to touchdown. Prepare for extreme weather conditions. I zipped my thermal jacket to the chin and pulled on my gloves. The temperature readout near the pilot showed minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. "Vacation spot, my ass," Matthew muttered, finally breaking his silence. The helicopter touched down with a jolt, skids crunching on packed snow. The side door slid open and a wall of cold hit me like a physical blow. I stepped onto Antarctic ground and the air burned my lungs with my first breath. Even through my cold weather gear, the chill found ways to bite at exposed skin. The wind whipped snow across the landing pad, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. A figure approached through the swirling white, bundled in a heavy parka with a fur-lined hood. As he got closer, I could make out Lieutenant Colonel insignia. "Delta Unit 7?" he shouted over the helicopter's dying rotors. I nodded and extended my hand. "Staff Sergeant Andrew Clark." "Lieutenant Colonel Pierce, Base Commander." His handshake was firm, but brief. "Let's get you inside before you freeze solid." As the rest of my team disembarked, I studied Pierce's face. His eyes darted between us and the base, something unsettled in them that didn't match his controlled voice. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in days. Pierce led us toward a cluster of connected prefabricated buildings half buried in snow. Security measures were immediately apparent: motion sensors, cameras at regular intervals, and a double fence perimeter extending around the compound. "Pretty serious security for a research station," Harrison commented beside me. Pierce glanced back. "Antarctic treaty requirements. This continent belongs to science, not military operations. The security is mostly for weather monitoring and wildlife management." It sounded rehearsed. The main airlock hissed as it equalized pressure, and we stepped into a heated corridor. The sudden warmth made my face tingle painfully as circulation returned. "This is Echo 7, Pierce said, gesturing down the hallway. "Established 3 years ago for deep ice research and atmospheric studies. You'll be taking over perimeter security from the Marines rotating out tomorrow. Your quarters are in the East Wing. Mess hall is central. I'll have Sergeant Walsh show you around after you stow your gear." As we moved through the base, I noticed the personnel we passed seemed on edge. Conversations stopped when we approached. Smiles looked forced. A technician in a lab coat made eye contact with me, then quickly looked away. "What's the current complement?" George asked. 27 research staff, 15 support personnel, and now your team makes 5 security," Pierce answered. "We're at minimum capacity until spring rotation." We reached our quarters, a shared room with 5 bunks and storage lockers. Nothing unusual for a temporary deployment, but the walls were thicker than standard, with extra insulation. Sergeant Walsh appeared at the door after we'd stowed our gear. He was a stocky man with a weathered face and the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen combat. "Mess hall's serving until 2100, he said without introduction. "I'll show you the security protocols after you eat." The mess hall was half full when we arrived. The food was better than expected. Hot stew, fresh bread, and even fresh fruit, impressive for such a remote location. I chose a table near a group of researchers, hoping to pick up some information. They spoke in low voices, but fragments drifted my way. Deep scans showed movement again last night. Hendricks thinks it's just geological anomalies. Protocol 7 if the readings spike again. One of them noticed me listening and nudged his colleagues. Their conversation immediately shifted to complaints about the weather. After dinner, Walsh took us on a tour of the security stations. The setup was comprehensive. Thermal imaging, ground-penetrating radar, motion detection that could pick up a penguin at 500 yards. "What exactly are we watching for out there?" I asked as Walsh demonstrated the monitoring system. He paused, his finger hovering over a control panel. "Standard protocol, wildlife management, weather monitoring, treaty enforcement." "That's a lot of equipment for penguins and snowstorms." Walsh's jaw tightened. "We've had issues with unauthorized research vessels approaching the exclusion zone. Some countries don't respect the treaty boundaries." It wasn't a complete lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. "Any specific threats we should know about?" Harrison pressed. "Nothing specific." Walsh's eyes didn't meet ours. "Colonel Pierce will brief you on daily assignments at 0600. First shift starts at 0700. As we headed back to our quarters, Cooper fell into step beside me. "You buying any of this?" he asked quietly. I shook my head slightly. "Something's off. Did you see the geological survey equipment in the East Wing? That's military-grade ground penetration tech, not scientific research stuff. And nobody's making eye contact," Matthew added from behind us, "like they're afraid they'll let something slip." Back in our quarters, we kept our discussion minimal, aware that the rooms might be monitored. We prepared for bed in the efficient routine of men who'd shared close quarters many times before. As I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. "I'm volunteering for perimeter patrol tomorrow morning," I said to no one in particular. "Looking for penguins?" George asked with a slight smile. "Looking for whatever has everyone here walking on eggshells," I replied. "I need to understand why we're really here." Harrison nodded from his bunk. "I'll take the afternoon shift. Between us, we might piece something together." I closed my eyes but remained alert, listening to the strange sounds of the base, the constant hum of heating systems, the occasional distant rumble that might have been ice shifting, and the peculiar silence that seemed to press in from outside, as if the entire continent was holding its breath. I patrolled the perimeter with Morrison, my eyes sweeping across the vast Antarctic landscape through my binoculars. The morning air bit at my exposed skin despite the layers of thermal gear, but I'd grown somewhat accustomed to it after our first day at Echo 7. "See anything interesting?" Morrison asked, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "Just ice and more ice," I replied, continuing my methodical scan. We trudged through the packed snow along the chain-link fence that marked the research station's boundaries. Our boots crunched with each step, the sound swallowed by the immense emptiness surrounding us. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the pristine white surface that stretched endlessly in all directions. I adjusted the focus on my binoculars as we approached the northeastern section of the perimeter. Something caught my eye, a subtle difference in the ice about 200 meters beyond the fence. I stopped walking and raised the binoculars again, narrowing my focus. "Hold up," I said to Morrison, who paused beside me. What I saw made my stomach tighten. Beneath the translucent surface of the ice was a massive dark shape, not small, not medium-sized, enormous. The thing looked to be the size of a city block, with what appeared to be curved appendages radiating outward from a central mass. It wasn't moving, but its presence was unmistakable against the pale blue-white of the surrounding ice. "What is it?" Morrison asked, moving closer. I handed him the binoculars and pointed. "About 200 meters out, beneath the surface. Tell me what you see." Morrison looked for several long seconds before lowering the binoculars. His expression had changed. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. "No idea," I said, taking the binoculars back for another look. The shape remained there, dark and still, like some massive creature frozen in time. "But we need to report this." We finished our patrol quickly and returned to the base. I went straight to Colonel Pierce's office and knocked on the door. "Enter," came his voice from inside. I stepped into the small, utilitarian room where Pierce sat behind a metal desk covered with papers and a laptop. He looked up at me with mild irritation. "What is it, Clark?" "Sir, during perimeter patrol, I observed something unusual about 200 meters beyond the northeastern fence line," I reported. "A large, dark mass beneath the ice, approximately the size of a city block with what looked like appendages extending from a central body." Pierce's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around the eyes, a momentary pause before he responded. "Geological formations, Clark," he said dismissively, though his eyes betrayed a hint of concern. "The ice sheet is full of them. Trapped sediment, rock formations, air pockets that create shadows. Nothing to be concerned about. With respect, sir, this didn't look geological. It appeared to have structure, symmetry." Pierce closed the laptop in front of him. "I appreciate your diligence, Sergeant, but we've been studying this region for years. What you saw is a known formation. I'll make a note of your report." His tone made it clear the conversation was over. I nodded and left his office, unconvinced by his explanation. The image of that dark shape lingered in my mind as I rejoined my team in the mess hall. 2 days passed with routine patrols and security checks. I tried to get another look at the shape under the ice, but heavy snowfall reduced visibility, making it impossible to see anything beyond 50 meters. On the third morning, I woke to unusual sounds echoing through the corridors: hurried footsteps, raised voices, the clatter of equipment being moved. I got dressed quickly and stepped out of our quarters to find the base in a state of barely controlled chaos. Base personnel rushed back and forth, carrying crates and equipment. Soldiers I recognized from the research team were loading items into large transport cases. No one stopped to explain what was happening. I found Harrison in the corridor. "What's going on?" "No idea," he said. "Woke up to this. They're packing up like they're abandoning ship." By mid-morning, the activity had intensified. I watched from the window of our quarters as a helicopter landed outside, and more equipment was loaded aboard. Another helicopter arrived 30 minutes later. By noon, it was clear what was happening: a full evacuation. The research staff, the scientists, the regular military personnel, all of them were leaving. The base, which had housed over 30 people when we arrived, was emptying out with alarming speed and no explanation. Finally, Colonel Pierce appeared in the doorway of our quarters. His face was tense, his uniform impeccable as always. "Gentlemen," he addressed our team, "there's been a change of plans. The research phase of this operation has concluded earlier than expected. All non-essential personnel are being evacuated." "What about us, sir?" George asked. "Your team will maintain security of the base until your relief arrives in 48 hours, Pierce said. "Standard protocols remain in place. The communications room is fully operational if you need to contact command." "Sir, what prompted this sudden evacuation?" I asked. Pierce's eyes met mine briefly. "Classified, Sergeant. You have your orders." With that, he turned and left. Within the hour, the last helicopter departed, carrying Pierce and the remaining research staff, leaving just our 5-man team alone at the massive research facility. "Anyone else think this is seriously messed up?" Harrison said as we watched the helicopter disappear into the distance. "They saw something," I said quietly. "Something that scared them enough to bail out in a hurry." "The thing under the ice?" Morrison asked. I nodded. "Has to be." That afternoon, the weather changed dramatically. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, quickly expanding to cover the sky. The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the buildings and driving snow horizontally across the compound. "Storm's coming," Matthew observed, looking out the window. A big one. Within hours, we were in the midst of a full Antarctic blizzard. The wind screamed like a living thing, rattling the windows and doors of the research station. Visibility dropped to 0. Looking out the windows revealed nothing but a wall of swirling white. I made my way to the communications room and tried to establish contact with command. The radio crackled with static as I cycled through the emergency frequencies. Echo 7 to command. Do you copy? Over. Nothing but static in response. Echo 7 to any receiving station. Do you copy? Over. I tried for nearly an hour, adjusting settings, checking connections, but the result was always the same: static. The storm had effectively cut us off from the outside world. I returned to the main room where the rest of the team had gathered. "Any luck?" Cooper asked. I shook my head. "Nothing. Storm's interfering with the signal. We're on our own until it passes." "How long do these Antarctic storms usually last?" George asked. "Could be hours, could be days," Matthew replied. "No way to know." The storm didn't let up. For 3 days, it raged around us, the wind and snow unrelenting. We maintained regular patrols inside the facility, checked the equipment, and took turns monitoring the communications equipment. But the result was always the same: static and isolation. By the 3rd day, tension had settled over our team like a physical weight. The constant howl of the wind, the creaking of the facility as it withstood the storm's assault, and the knowledge that we were completely cut off from the outside world wore on our nerves. I stood in the communications room, staring at the useless radio equipment. The storm had trapped us here, alone with whatever had caused the entire research team to evacuate without warning. And somewhere out there, beyond the northeastern perimeter, that massive shape lurked beneath the ice, waiting. I slept fitfully that night, tossing in my bunk as the howling Antarctic wind rattled the base windows. The storm had trapped us here for a 2nd day, cutting us off from the outside world as completely as if we'd been dropped on another planet. I finally drifted off sometime after midnight, exhausted from maintaining patrols in the blizzard conditions. Then the dream came. I stood alone on a vast sheet of ice, the surface beneath my boots smooth as glass. The sky above was an impossible color, not black or blue, but something deeper, like the space between stars had been painted across the horizon. The cold felt different than the Antarctic chill I'd grown used to. This was older, more primal. A sound like thunder rolled across the plain. I looked down and saw hairline cracks spreading through the ice beneath my feet, not from my weight, but from something moving below. The cracks widened, and through them, I glimpsed movement, something massive shifting in the depths. The ice split open in a jagged line that stretched to the horizon. From the widening gap, something began to emerge, appendages that writhed and twisted like tentacles but seemed wrong somehow, moving with a purpose that felt intelligent. They were followed by a shape so vast my mind couldn't process it all at once. I caught glimpses of eyes, if you could call them that, black holes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I tried to run, but found myself frozen in place as the creature continued its emergence, ice cracking and falling away from its ancient form. I woke up with a gasp, sitting bolt upright in my bunk. My heart was racing, and sweat soaked through my t-shirt despite the cold. The dream had felt more solid, more real than the metal walls of the research station around me. I could still feel the ice cracking beneath my feet, still see those black, absorbing eyes. "You okay, Clark?" Harrison mumbled from his bunk. "Yeah," I said, though I wasn't convinced. "Just a dream." I didn't fall back asleep that night. I sat up, cleaning my sidearm, trying to focus on the familiar routine rather than the images that kept flashing through my mind. By morning, The dream had faded enough that I could almost convince myself it was just stress and isolation playing tricks on my mind. The storm continued to rage outside, limiting visibility to almost nothing. We maintained our patrols inside the base, checking the structural integrity and making sure no snow had blocked any emergency exits. The day passed slowly, with tension building among the team as we remained cut off from command. That night, I hesitated before lying down, almost afraid to close my eyes. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. The dream returned, but worse. This time, the creature had fully emerged from the ice. It towered above me like a living mountain, its body defying description, part crustacean, part cephalopod, but with elements that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them. Its movements sent tremors through the ground, each step causing what felt like earthquakes. I ran. The ice had given way to the corridors of Echo 7, but they were warping and collapsing around me. I sprinted through hallways that twisted in impossible angles, past doors that opened onto voids. All the while, I felt a presence pressing against my mind, not a voice, but a consciousness, ancient and alien. Images flooded my brain. The creature trapped in ice for eons, sleeping, dreaming. I felt its hunger, not just for food, but for living things, for thoughts and experiences it could consume. I understood with sudden clarity that it had been aware of us from the moment we arrived at Echo 7, that it had been reaching out, touching our minds while it waited. Clark, wake up. Someone was shaking me. I opened my eyes to see Morrison standing over me, his face tight with concern. "What is it?" I asked, my voice rough. "Jackson's missing," Morrison said. "No one's seen him since lights out." I sat up, instantly alert. "How long?" "At least 3 hours. Chen noticed his bunk was empty during the midnight bed check." I pulled on my boots and grabbed my jacket. "Have you checked the entire base?" Morrison nodded. "We've been searching for the past hour. Nothing." The team had gathered in the main corridor, all looking tense and sleep-deprived. Harrison was checking his tablet, pulling up the base schematics. "We've covered all the main areas," he said. No sign of him. "Guys," Chen called from down the hall. "I found something." We rushed to where Chen stood by one of the outer doors. It was standing open, snow drifting in across the threshold. "Jesus," Harrison muttered. "He went outside? In this?" I looked through the open door at the swirling white beyond. The storm had eased slightly, but conditions were still brutal. 40 below with wind chill. Visibility maybe 20 meters at best. "We need to go after him," I said, already moving toward the equipment locker. "Morrison, you're with me. The rest of you maintain position here in case he comes back." Morrison and I grabbed emergency gear, thermal suits, rescue blankets, medical kits, and high-powered flashlights. We strapped on snowshoes and pulled on our face masks. "Radio check," I said into my comm. "Copy," came Harrison's voice. "We'll monitor from here. Be careful out there." Morrison and I stepped through the door into the storm. The wind hit us immediately, trying to push us back inside, but we leaned into it and moved forward. The beam of my flashlight caught the faint impression of footprints already being filled in by fresh snow. "There!" I pointed. "He was heading northeast." We followed the tracks, moving as quickly as the conditions allowed. The footprints were erratic, weaving back and forth as if Jackson had been disoriented or fighting against something pulling him forward. "Why would he come out here?" Morrison shouted over the wind. I didn't answer. I knew exactly where Jackson was heading, toward the northeastern perimeter, toward the dark shape I had seen lurking under the ice, the same shape that had risen from the depths in my dreams. I trudged through knee-deep snow, following Jackson's erratic footprints that weaved back and forth across the white expanse. The wind howled around us, cutting through my thermal gear despite its protective layers. Morrison stayed close behind me, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as we fought against the storm. "These tracks make no sense," I called back to Morrison, my voice barely audible above the wind. It's like he was drunk or fighting with someone. The footprints zigzagged in unnatural patterns, sometimes doubling back before lurching in another direction. In places, the snow showed signs of someone falling, then dragging themselves up again. Whatever had happened to Jackson, he hadn't simply walked out here. He'd been struggling against something. "Clark, I see something ahead," Morrison shouted. I squinted through the swirling snow and caught a glimpse of a dark shape on the ground. My stomach tightened as we pushed forward, our snowshoes crunching through the icy crust. As we got closer, the shape took form, a human body, curled on its side in the snow. "Jackson!" I yelled, though I knew he couldn't possibly hear me over the storm. We rushed the final few meters, and what I saw made my blood run cold despite the adrenaline pumping through me. Jackson lay completely naked in the snow, his skin a ghastly blue-white. His clothes were nowhere to be seen. "What the hell?" Morrison breathed beside me. I dropped to my knees and pressed my gloved fingers against Jackson's neck, searching for a pulse. For several terrifying seconds, I felt nothing. Then, just as I was about to give up, I detected the faintest flutter beneath my fingertips. So weak, I almost missed it. "He's alive," I said, "but barely. We need to get him wrapped up now." Morrison was already pulling emergency blankets from his pack. I checked Jackson's extremities for frostbite. His fingers and toes showed severe signs of exposure. How long had he been out here? And why the hell was he naked in an Antarctic blizzard? As I worked to wrap the reflective material around his frozen limbs, Jackson's eyelids suddenly fluttered. His eyes opened, unfocused at first, then with tremendous effort, locked onto mine. The look in them chilled me more than the surrounding ice, a mixture of terror and something else I couldn't name. His cracked lips moved, trying to form words. I leaned down, putting my ear next to his mouth to catch whatever he was trying to say. "It's still down there," Jackson whispered, his voice so faint I could barely hear it even this close. "Waiting, dreaming. It knows we're here." A violent shudder ran through his body. I pulled back slightly to look at his face and saw his eyes roll back in his head, the whites showing as his body went completely limp. "Jackson!" I pressed my fingers to his neck again, searching desperately for the pulse I'd felt moments before. Nothing. I tried his wrist. Nothing. I placed my ear against his chest, listening for any sign of a heartbeat or breath. Silence. "He's gone," I said, looking up at Morrison, whose face had drained of color behind his frost-covered mask. "What happened to him? What was he talking about?" Morrison asked, his voice shaking. I shook my head, remembering the dark shape I'd seen beneath the ice days earlier. "I don't know. Let's get him back to base." We finished wrapping Jackson's body in the emergency blankets, creating a makeshift shroud. I took his shoulders while Morrison grabbed his feet, and together we lifted him. The body was already stiffening in the extreme cold. The journey back was brutal. The storm seemed to fight us every step of the way, as if it didn't want us taking Jackson from this place. The wind pushed against us with such force that several times we had to stop and brace ourselves to avoid being blown over. Snow pelted our faces, finding every gap in our protective gear. "We need to keep moving," I shouted to Morrison after one such pause. "We stay out here much longer, and they'll be recovering 3 bodies instead of 1. Morrison nodded grimly, and we pressed on, our muscles burning with the effort of carrying Jackson's dead weight through the deep snow. The base seemed impossibly far away, though I knew it couldn't be more than a few hundred meters. When we finally reached the outer door, Harrison and George were waiting for us, their faces tight with worry. They helped us bring Jackson inside, their questions dying on their lips when they saw the state of the body. "What happened out there?" Harrison asked as we laid Jackson on a table in the medical bay. "I don't know," I admitted. "We found him naked in the snow, about 50 meters from the fence line. He was barely alive when we got to him, said something strange, then died, right there." "What did he say?" George asked. I hesitated, looking down at Jackson's face, now covered by one of the blankets. He said, "It's still down there, waiting, dreaming. It knows we're here." A heavy silence fell over the room. No one wanted to ask the obvious question. What was Jackson talking about? "We should try to contact command again," I said finally. "Let them know what happened." Harrison nodded. "I'll keep trying the radio. Storm's still blocking most signals, but I might get lucky." We spent the rest of the night in shifts, 2 of us watching over Jackson's body while the others tried to rest. None of us slept much. The wind continued to howl outside, but something about it had changed. It seemed less chaotic, more purposeful, as if it were speaking in a language just beyond our understanding. I took the last watch before dawn, sitting alone with Jackson's body in the dim medical bay. I couldn't stop thinking about his final words and the look in his eyes. Whatever he'd seen or experienced out there in the snow had terrified him completely. As the hours passed, I noticed the storm beginning to quiet. The constant howling of the wind gradually diminished until, just before sunrise, it stopped entirely. The sudden silence was almost as unnerving as the storm had been. I stepped out into the corridor and made my way to a window. Outside, the world had transformed. The sky was clear and blue, the sun reflecting blindingly off the pristine white landscape. It was as if the storm had never happened. And then I heard it. The distant thump of helicopter rotors cutting through the still air. "Harrison, George, Morrison," I called out. "We've got company." They appeared quickly, looking as exhausted as I felt. We moved to the main entrance, watching as a military helicopter descended onto the landing pad. The side door slid open before the rotors had even stopped, and a group of men in cold weather gear jumped out. At their head was Colonel Hayes, a man I'd met only briefly during our deployment briefing. We met them at the door, standing at attention despite our exhaustion. "Colonel Hayes," I said, saluting. He returned the salute crisply. "Sergeant Clark, I understand you've had an incident." "Yes, sir. We lost Jackson last night. Found him outside in the storm." Hayes nodded, his expression giving away nothing. "Show me." I led him and what appeared to be a medical team to where Jackson's body lay. Hayes approached the table and pulled back the blanket, examining the body with clinical detachment. The medical team joined him, taking notes and photographs. "What was he doing outside?" Hayes asked without looking up. "Unknown, sir. He went missing during the night. By the time we found him, he was nearly frozen. He died moments after we reached him." Hayes glanced at me. "Did he say anything before he died?" I hesitated, remembering Jackson's strange words. "Yes, sir," he said. "It's still down there, waiting, dreaming. It knows we're here." Hayes's expression flickered for just an instant. Something like recognition crossed his face before his professional mask slipped back into place. "Delirium from hypothermia," he said dismissively. "Common in extreme cold exposure cases." "Sir, with respect, Jackson was found naked nearly 50 meters from the base," I pressed, "and his tracks showed he was fighting something. This wasn't a simple case of wandering outside." Hayes straightened up, fixing me with a hard stare. "Sergeant Clark, in extreme hypothermia cases, victims often experience what's called paradoxical undressing. They feel hot and remove their clothes. The disorientation explains the erratic path. This is a straightforward storm casualty." His tone made it clear the matter was closed, but I couldn't let it go so easily. "Sir, there's something else. 3 days ago, I spotted what looked like a large mass beneath the ice to the northeast. That's the direction Jackson was heading." "I'm not interested in geological formations, Sergeant," Hayes cut me off. "We're evacuating immediately. Pack your essential gear. The body will be transported separately." "Yes, sir," I replied, knowing further argument would be useless. Hayes turned to the medical team. "Prepare the body for transport. I want wheels up in 30 minutes. As Hayes walked away, I caught Morrison looking at me, his expression troubled. He'd been there when we found Jackson, had heard his last words too. We both knew there was more to this story than Hayes was willing to acknowledge. Within the hour, we were loaded onto the helicopter. Our mission at Echo 7 abruptly terminated. As we lifted off, I looked down at the research station growing smaller beneath us. Somewhere below that ice was something ancient and aware, something that had reached out and claimed Jackson in the night, and Hayes knew exactly what it was. I tried to explain what Jackson had said about the dreams and the shape beneath the ice. Hayes sat across from me in the debriefing room, his face expressionless as I described the dark mass I'd spotted during perimeter patrol and how it connected to Jackson's final words. He was terrified, sir, said something was down there, waiting and dreaming. I saw it myself days earlier, a massive dark shape under the ice in that exact same area where we found him. Hayes didn't blink. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his weathered face, making him look older than his 50-some years. His fingers remained perfectly still on the metal table between us. And you believe these dreams Jackson mentioned were somehow connected to this shape you claim to have seen? His tone was flat, clinical. Yes, sir. I experienced similar dreams myself. There was something down there, something aware of us. Hayes leaned back in his chair. The metal legs scraped against the concrete floor, the sound sharp in the otherwise silent room. Staff Sergeant Clark, all details regarding your deployment to Research Station Echo 7 are classified under National Security Directive 469. This debriefing is merely procedural. He stood up, straightening his uniform jacket. You're dismissed. Sir, with all due respect. Dismissed, Staff Sergeant. I left the room with questions burning in my throat. The hallway outside felt too bright, too normal compared to what we'd experienced in Antarctica. Other personnel walked past me, going about their daily routines as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. Back at Fort Bragg a week later, I sat at my desk typing up my official report. I included everything: the dark shape beneath the ice, Jackson's erratic behavior before his disappearance, his naked body in the snow, and his final words about something waiting below. I described my own dreams in clinical detail, noting the similarities to what Jackson had experienced. The report ran 15 pages, the most thorough documentation I'd ever produced. I submitted it through the proper channels and waited. 3 days passed before Lieutenant Colonel Mercer called me into his office. Clark, he said as I stood at attention before his desk, your Antarctica report has been processed. Yes, sir. Has there been any follow-up investigation scheduled? Mercer's eyes narrowed slightly. The matter is closed, Staff Sergeant. Closed, sir. One of our men died under extremely unusual circumstances. There was clearly something. The matter is closed, he repeated, his voice hardening. Your report has been filed with the appropriate classification. There will be no further discussion on this topic. I felt my jaw tighten. Sir, I believe this situation warrants... Let me be perfectly clear, Clark. Mercer stood up, placing both palms flat on his desk. Further questions on this matter would constitute insubordination. Do I make myself understood? I stared at him for a long moment before responding. Perfectly, sir. Good. You're on training rotation starting tomorrow. 600 hours. Dismissed. The next few months passed in a blur of routine. Field exercises, weapons training, physical conditioning. The familiar rhythm of military life should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like going through motions, a performance of normalcy while something fundamental had changed. I tried to access my report through official channels. Each attempt hit a wall of classification codes I'd never seen before. It was as if Echo 7 had been erased from official records. The dreams still came, though less frequently. I'd wake up gasping, feeling the cold press of that ancient consciousness against my mind. Sometimes I'd see the appendages breaking through the ice, other times just those black, absorbing eyes. The dreams were less intense now, like echoes, rather than the full force I'd experienced at the research station, but they persisted. During my off hours, I found myself hunched over my laptop, searching for anything related to Antarctic research stations. Most of the information was general: scientific missions, climate studies, international cooperation. Nothing about Echo 7 specifically. I scoured satellite images of the Antarctic continent, trying to pinpoint its location based on our flight path and the surrounding terrain I remembered. After weeks of searching, I found a small notation on an obscure geological survey map, a tiny square marked only as E7 in an area that matched my recollections. The notation disappeared from the online archives 3 days later. I reached out to Harrison first, catching him after a training exercise. "Hey, got a minute?" I asked as he packed his gear. "Sure, what's up?" He didn't look up from his task. "Been thinking about Antarctica, about what happened to Jackson." His hands paused for just a fraction of a second. "Antarctica? When were we in Antarctica?" I stared at him. "Echo 7, the research station, Jackson dying in the snow. You were there, Harrison." He zipped his bag closed and finally met my eyes. His expression was blank, but something in his gaze seemed off. "Think you've got me confused with someone else, Clark. I've never been to Antarctica. We were there together for almost 2 weeks. The evacuation, the storm. Look, I've got to report to Captain Lewis. See you around." He walked away without looking back. I tried Morrison next, catching him alone in the mess hall. "Remember those dreams at Echo 7? I asked without preamble, sliding into the seat across from him. "The ones about something under the ice?" Morrison's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. He lowered it slowly. "What dreams?" "In Antarctica, the research station. You were with me when we found Jackson." He shook his head. "Don't know what you're talking about, man. I've never been to Antarctica." We carried Jackson's body back through the storm together. Morrison pushed his tray away and stood up. "You feeling okay, Clark? Maybe you should see the doc." George and Matthew gave me similar responses. George claimed he'd been on leave during the time period in question. Matthew just looked at me with genuine confusion and suggested I might be mixing up a training exercise with something else. I sat alone in my quarters that night, staring at the wall. Had I imagined it all? The dark shape beneath the ice, Jackson's naked body in the snow, his final terrified words. The dreams felt real, still felt real when they came. But with no records I could access and my entire team either lying or genuinely not remembering, I began to question my own memories. I pulled out my personal notebook where I jotted down notes after returning, dates, coordinates, details about Echo 7's layout. The pages felt like evidence of something that had never happened, according to everyone else. Maybe they were right. Maybe the stress of deployment had created some kind of shared delusion that only I remembered now. Maybe there had been something in the water at Echo 7 that caused hallucinations, and I was the only one still affected. Or maybe something had gotten to them, the same something that had gotten to Jackson. I closed my notebook and tucked it away in my footlocker. Whether Echo 7 had been real or not, the dreams still came. And in those dreams, something ancient and patient waited beneath the ice, watching and hungry. I scrolled through the news on my laptop, coffee cooling beside me on the kitchen table. 16 years of military routine had given way to civilian habits. Morning news with breakfast, a 9-to-5 security consulting job, a quiet house in a Maryland suburb. The headline caught my eye mid-scroll, and my finger froze above the trackpad. Massive iceberg breaks away from Antarctic ice shelf. Something tightened in my chest. I clicked the link, and the article loaded with a satellite image that filled most of my screen. The photo showed an enormous chunk of ice that had separated from the Antarctic continent, floating free in the dark waters of the Southern Ocean. My coffee sat forgotten as I leaned closer to the screen, studying the coordinates listed in the caption. They matched the area where research station Echo 7 had been located, the exact spot where we'd been stationed in '97, where Jackson had died. I zoomed in on the image, tracing the irregular outline of the massive iceberg with my eyes. The contours were familiar, too familiar. The same curves and protrusions I'd seen through my binoculars 16 years ago when I'd spotted that dark shape beneath the ice during perimeter patrol. the same shape that had haunted my dreams ever since. "This can't be a coincidence," I whispered to my empty kitchen. I read through the article, my hands growing cold despite the warm March morning. The scientists quoted in the piece expressed confusion about the iceberg's formation. A glaciologist from the University of Colorado called it unprecedented in size and structure. Another researcher noted its unusual density patterns that didn't match typical ice shelf breakaways. The calving process appears to have occurred from below rather than through the normal surface fracturing we typically observe, one expert noted. "It's as if something pushed up through the ice." I scrolled back to the image, studying it more carefully. The satellite photo showed what looked like a shadow beneath the floating mass, darker than the surrounding ocean. The article dismissed it as a trick of light or imaging artifact. I knew better. Jackson's final words came back to me with perfect clarity. "It's down there, waiting, dreaming." The same words he'd gasped before dying in the Antarctic snow, naked and terrified. The room seemed to grow colder as understanding settled over me. Whatever had been trapped beneath the ice, that ancient thing I'd glimpsed in both waking life and nightmares, was now free. The massive iceberg wasn't just ice. It was a vessel, carrying something that had waited patiently for millennia. I closed my laptop slowly, as if making any sudden movement might somehow alert it to my awareness. Standing up from the table, I walked to my front window and looked out at the quiet suburban street. Kids rode bikes past my house. A neighbor walked her dog. Cars pulled out of driveways as people headed to work. None of them knew. None of them felt what I felt. That lingering presence that had taken up residence in the back of my mind since Antarctica. That ancient, patient hunger that sometimes pressed against my consciousness in the darkest hours of night. It was out there now, drifting through the world's oceans. No longer trapped, no longer dreaming. Waiting. I couldn't ignore what I'd found. The satellite image of that massive iceberg breaking away exactly where Echo 7 had stood 16 years ago was too specific to be coincidence. After 3 days of internal debate, I made the call. Hayes answered on the fourth ring. His voice sounded older than I remembered, raspier. "Colonel Hayes, this is Staff Sergeant Andrew Clark. We need to talk about Antarctica." A long pause followed. I expected him to hang up or deny knowing me. "Hilton Garden Inn, Route 29, Room 212, tomorrow at 10. He disconnected before I could respond. I sat back in my chair, staring at my phone. I hadn't expected him to agree so easily. Something had changed. The next morning, I arrived 20 minutes early and parked where I could watch the entrance. Old habits. At 9:55, I walked through the lobby, taking note of exits and security cameras. Standard protocol when meeting someone who might consider you a threat. I knocked on room 212 at exactly 10. Hayes opened the door immediately, as if he'd been standing there waiting. The man before me barely resembled the stern colonel I remembered from the debriefing room. His face was gaunt, with deep lines etched around his mouth and eyes. His silver hair had thinned considerably, and his shoulders hunched slightly beneath his button-down shirt. "Clark." He stepped aside to let me in. "I figured you'd come looking eventually." The room was standard hotel fare, beige walls, generic landscape prints, a small desk with a chair. Hayes had set up a laptop on the desk, and several manila folders were stacked beside it. "You've aged," he said, gesturing for me to sit in the desk chair while he took the edge of the bed. "So have you, sir." He almost smiled. "Retirement doesn't suit me. Too much time to think." He studied me carefully. "You're still having the dreams, aren't you?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't mentioned dreams during our debriefing 16 years ago. I'd only told him about Jackson's final words and the shape I'd seen beneath the ice. "How did you know about the dreams?" Hayes rubbed his face with one hand. "Everyone who stays at Echo 7 long enough has them. It's one of the first signs of contact." "Contact with what exactly?" He looked at me for a long moment, then reached for one of the folders. We've known about it since 1956. Early geological surveys detected an anomaly beneath the ice, something that didn't match the surrounding density patterns. Initially, they thought it was a unique geological formation, maybe a pocket of minerals or a cave system. He opened the folder and passed me a black and white photograph. It showed a grainy sonar image with a massive dark shape clearly visible beneath layers of ice. This was taken in 1962. By then, they knew it wasn't geological. I studied the image. Even with the primitive technology, the shape was unmistakable. The same curved appendages, the same massive bulk I'd seen during my perimeter patrol and in my dreams. What is it? Hayes shook his head. We don't know. Not exactly. The working theory is that it's some kind of ancient organism that became trapped in the ice during the last ice age, or earlier. An organism? That thing is the size of a city block. Yes. Hayes reached for another folder. Research Station Echo 7 wasn't a geological research facility. It was built specifically to monitor the entity, to make sure it stayed where it was. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. You knew what was down there the whole time. Yes. Then why bring in my team? Why not tell us what we were guarding? Hayes looked up from the folder. Because we needed witnesses, people who could verify what happened if containment failed. Witnesses? I stood up, anger rising in my chest. Jackson died out there. I know. Hayes didn't flinch. The evacuation happened because our instruments detected movement beneath the ice, subtle shifts that hadn't been recorded in all the years we'd been monitoring it. We couldn't risk keeping non-essential personnel on site. So you left us there? As what? Bait? As observers. If something happened, we needed trained military personnel who could report accurately. I paced the small room, trying to process what he was telling me. And afterward, when we all filed our reports, when I specifically mentioned seeing something beneath the ice, your reports were classified. The official record states that Private Jackson suffered a psychotic break due to isolation and wandered into a storm. That's a lie. Of course it is. Hayes looked tired, but it's better than the truth. I stopped pacing and faced him, which is that something ancient and not from this earth has been trapped in the Antarctic ice for thousands of years. Something aware, something that can reach into human minds and influence their behavior. He looked up at me. Something that may have caused Jackson to walk naked into a blizzard. The room felt suddenly smaller. I remembered Jackson's erratic footprints in the snow, how they seemed to suggest he was fighting against something pulling him. I remembered his final words. It's down there, waiting, dreaming. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Hayes closed the folder. Because you reached out. Because after 16 years of silence, you contacted me, which means you've found something. I pulled out my phone and showed him the news article about the iceberg with the satellite image. This broke off exactly where Echo 7 was located. Hayes took the phone, his hand visibly shaking as he enlarged the image, his face drained of color. The article mentions unusual density patterns, I continued, and that scientists think something pushed up from below the ice. That's it, isn't it? Whatever was down there broke free. Hayes didn't answer. He stared at the image, his breathing shallow. Colonel? He stood abruptly and moved to his own phone on the nightstand. I need to make a call. I watched as he dialed a number from memory and turned away from me. It's Hayes. Authentication code Sierra Tango 947. A pause. The package is mobile. I repeat, the package is mobile. Confirmation required immediately. Another pause. Hayes listened, his shoulders tensing. Understood. Implementing protocol Blackfish. He hung up and turned to me, his expression grim. You need to leave. Now. What's happening? I've said too much already. He began gathering the folders quickly. Go home, Clark. Forget about this. Forget about Antarctica. That's not going to happen, sir. Hayes stopped and looked at me. For a moment, I saw something like regret in his eyes. Then I'm sorry for what comes next. He showed me to the door. As I stepped into the hallway, he said quietly, "The dreams will get worse now. It's fully awake." The door closed before I could respond. I drove home in a daze, Hayes' words echoing in my mind. Something ancient and not from this earth. The package is mobile. I'm sorry for what comes next. Back in my apartment, I paced restlessly, unable to shake the feeling that I'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. By nightfall, I'd convinced myself I was being paranoid. Hayes was retired, possibly suffering from dementia or some stress disorder from years of service. His talk of ancient organisms and mind control seemed far-fetched in the light of my familiar living room. I went to bed around midnight, exhausted from the day's revelations. Sleep came quickly, but it wasn't restful. The sound of breaking glass jerked me awake. For a moment, I thought it was part of my dream, the ice cracking as something massive pushed through from below. Then I heard the soft thud of boots on carpet. Someone was in my apartment. I rolled silently out of bed, years of training taking over. The digital clock read 3:17 in the morning. I reached under my bed for the handgun I kept there, then pressed myself against the wall beside my bedroom door. More footsteps, at least 3 people moving with practiced precision, military or special ops training. They were conducting a sweep, room by room. "Bedroom clear," a voice whispered from my guest room across the hall. They'd be at my door next. I had seconds to decide. My gaze fell on the window leading to the fire escape. It was my only option. I moved quickly to my closet, grabbing the emergency bag I'd prepared years ago. Cash, spare ID, basic supplies. Old habits from my military days that suddenly seemed prescient. The footsteps grew closer. I eased the window open and slipped out onto the metal landing just as my bedroom door swung open. Through the gap in the curtains, I glimpsed men in black tactical gear, faces obscured by balaclavas, weapons raised. I descended the fire escape as quietly as possible, the cold metal biting into my bare feet. Behind me, I heard a voice. "Target not in bed. Check the bathroom." When I reached the alley below, I ran. The March air was cold against my skin. I was wearing only sweatpants and a t-shirt, but adrenaline kept me warm as I sprinted through back alleys and side streets. I didn't stop until I reached a 24-hour diner 12 blocks away. From a booth in the back, I watched the street for signs of pursuit while my breathing slowly returned to normal. I knew I couldn't go home again. Whoever those men were, they'd been sent to find me, to silence me. Hayes had made that call, and within hours, a tactical team had breached my apartment. The implications were clear. Powerful people wanted to keep whatever was now free in the ocean a secret. I ordered coffee I didn't drink and planned my next move. I had my emergency bag. My car was parked in a garage 3 blocks from my apartment, and I had enough cash to disappear for a while. The question was, where would I go? And what would I do once I got there? As dawn broke, I left the diner and made my way cautiously to my car. No one followed me. I drove west, no destination in mind, just putting distance between myself and whatever had happened in my apartment. As the miles accumulated, I felt a familiar pressure building behind my eyes. The dreams were coming back, even though I was wide awake. Flashes of dark water, massive appendages unfurling after centuries of confinement, an ancient intelligence stretching outward, sensing the world around it. The visions were stronger now, more vivid than they'd ever been. Hayes was right. It was fully awake, and somehow it knew I was watching. I parked my truck behind the cabin, hidden from the gravel road by a cluster of pine trees. The place looked exactly like the online listing had promised. Isolated, basic, and miles from the nearest neighbor. Perfect for someone who needed to disappear. The key was under the stone frog by the back door, just as the owner had said in his email. I grabbed it, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. my boots creaking on the wooden floor. The cabin smelled of pine and old fireplaces with a hint of mustiness that spoke of months without visitors. I set my duffel bag on the kitchen table and pulled out my laptop. The satellite internet connection was weak but functional, another reason I'd chosen this place. I needed to stay connected without being easily traced. My head throbbed. I hadn't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch since fleeing my apartment 5 days ago. Every time I closed my eyes, the dreams came. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain shut, then checked the doors and windows to make sure everything was secure. Old habits from my military days. I knew locks wouldn't keep out the thing that haunted me, but the routine helped calm my mind. The cabin had 1 bedroom, a small bathroom, a kitchenette, and a living area with a stone fireplace. The furniture was old but sturdy, a couch with a faded plaid pattern, a wooden coffee table, and a rocking chair that looked like it had been there since the cabin was built. I'd paid cash for 2 weeks up front, with no questions asked. I made coffee on the ancient stovetop and sat at the kitchen table, opening my laptop. My hands shook slightly as I typed. I needed to understand what was happening, to find some way to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. Night came quickly in the mountains. I held off sleep as long as I could, but eventually, exhaustion won out. The dream came as soon as I closed my eyes. I was underwater, drifting in darkness, not swimming, just existing, suspended in the cold depths. Around me, the ocean was black and endless. I could feel pressure, the weight of thousands of feet of water above me. But I wasn't afraid of drowning. In the dream, I didn't need to breathe. Something moved in the distance, a vast shape, darker than the surrounding water. It pulsed and shifted, its edges blurring and reforming. I couldn't tell if it was miles away or right in front of me. In the dream, distance seemed meaningless. I felt its awareness like a physical touch. It was awake now, fully conscious after eons of dormancy. Its thoughts weren't human. They were older, slower, more patient. It was learning, absorbing information from the world around it. I could feel its curiosity about the ships that passed overhead, the sonar that pinged against its surface, the strange creatures that built things on the land beyond the water. It knew about cities. It knew about people. It was learning more every day. I woke up gasping, my shirt soaked with sweat despite the cabin's chill. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:17 in the morning. I stumbled to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, avoiding my reflection in the mirror. The dreams were getting worse, more detailed, more real, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just dreams, that I was somehow connecting with the thing that had broken free from the Antarctic ice. I made more coffee and opened my laptop again. Sleep was impossible now. Instead, I started searching for any news about the iceberg that had calved from the ice shelf where Echo 7 had stood. The scientific community was baffled. The iceberg, designated B39 by international tracking protocols, was behaving strangely. It was moving faster than predicted, and its path didn't match computer models based on ocean currents and wind patterns. I dug deeper, searching maritime forums and local news sources along the projected path of the iceberg. Strange reports were starting to emerge, fishing boats experiencing unexplained equipment failures, navigation systems going haywire, sonar readings that made no sense. A Chilean research vessel had gone missing 3 days ago after reporting unusual disturbances in the water near the iceberg. The official story blamed rough seas and mechanical failure, but the timing was too convenient to be coincidence. Most disturbing were the reports from fishing crews about bizarre behavior in marine life. Schools of fish suddenly changing direction, whales abandoning their normal migration routes, deep-sea creatures rising to the surface where they didn't belong. Nature itself seemed to be responding to something in the water. I saved everything I could find, downloading articles and images to a folder on my laptop. The pattern was clear to me, even if no one else had connected the dots yet. The thing beneath the ice was moving, and its influence was spreading. As morning light filtered through the cabin windows, I made a decision. I needed to talk to someone who might understand, someone who had been there at Echo 7. Hayes was out of the question. He was part of whatever government operation had been monitoring the thing. My team members had all denied remembering Antarctica, except I hadn't tried contacting George Thornton yet. He'd been the quiet one, the tech specialist who kept to himself. If anyone might remember, or might admit to remembering, it would be him. It took me most of the day to track down his current contact information. George had left the military 2 years after our Antarctic deployment and dropped off the grid. Eventually, I found him listed as a systems consultant for a marine research institute in Oregon. I called the number listed on their website, not expecting much. Pacific Coastal Research, this is Thornton. His voice was exactly as I remembered it, calm, measured, slightly detached. George, it's Andrew Clark. A long pause. I could hear him breathing. Andrew. He didn't sound surprised. I've been having the dreams too. My heart raced. You remember Antarctica? I remember everything, he said quietly. Echo 7, Jackson, the thing under the ice. I tried to forget, but the dreams started again when that iceberg broke off. We need to talk, I said. Face to face. Another pause. There's a coastal observation station near Coos Bay where I've been monitoring the iceberg's progress. Meet me there tomorrow at noon. I'll text you the coordinates. I'll be there, I promised. Andrew? His voice had an edge I'd never heard before. Be careful who you talk to. I think they're watching all of us from Echo 7. The line went dead. I packed my essentials immediately, leaving most of my things at the cabin. If George was right about being watched, I couldn't risk leading anyone to our meeting. I drove through the night, stopping only for gas and coffee. The coastal highway was nearly empty, winding along cliffs that dropped hundreds of feet to the Pacific Ocean below. As dawn broke, I could see the water stretching to the horizon, gray and restless under a cloudy sky. The observation station was perched on a rocky outcropping, accessible only by a narrow gravel road that branched off from the highway. It was a modern structure, all glass and steel, designed to withstand the coastal storms that battered this part of the Oregon coast. I parked next to a single vehicle, a blue Subaru that I guessed was George's, and approached the building cautiously. The front door was unlocked, which immediately put me on alert. I pushed it open slowly, listening for any sound from inside. George? I called out. No answer. The station was eerily quiet. Monitors glowed on desks, computers hummed, but there was no sign of people. Coffee cups sat half-empty beside keyboards. Jackets hung over the backs of chairs. It looked like everyone had simply walked away in the middle of their work. I moved deeper into the facility, checking rooms as I went. The main research area was a large open space with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the ocean. Sophisticated equipment lined the walls. Weather monitors, satellite feeds, oceanographic instruments. George? I called again. In here. His voice came from a small office off the main room. I found him hunched over a computer, his face illuminated by the screen. He looked older than I remembered, his black hair now streaked with gray, lines etched around his eyes. He didn't look up when I entered. Where is everyone? I asked. I sent them home. He still didn't look at me. Told them there was a gas leak. I needed to show you this without anyone else around. He gestured to the screen, where a satellite image showed a massive white shape in the dark ocean. I moved closer to look at the satellite image. The iceberg, if it could still be called that, had changed since the last photos I'd seen. Its edges were no longer the clean, straight lines created by calving from the ice shelf. Now they curved and bulged in places, as if the ice was being reshaped from within. That's from yesterday, George said, clicking to another image. This is from 3 hours ago. The new image showed the same ice mass, but its shape had altered further. What had been roughly rectangular was now more circular, with protrusions extending from several sides. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. It's changing, I said. George nodded. And look at this. He pulled up an oceanographic chart showing currents in the South Pacific. A red line traced the iceberg's path over the past 2 weeks. It's moving against the Antarctic circumpolar current. That's impossible without propulsion. It's not drifting, I realized. It's swimming. Exactly. George clicked through more screens, showing data readouts I couldn't interpret. Water temperature around it is 2 degrees higher than it should be. Sonar readings show density patterns that don't match ice, and it's accelerating. I leaned against the desk, trying to process what I was seeing. Have you reported this? George laughed, a short, bitter sound. To who? The same people who covered up what happened at Echo 7? I tried contacting Hayes 3 days ago. His number's disconnected and his department claims he's on extended leave. He stood up and walked to a large map pinned to the wall. Red pins marked the iceberg's position at different dates, showing its progress northward from Antarctica. At its current speed, it will reach populated coastlines within 2 weeks, George said. Faster if it continues to accelerate. We need to warn people, I said. With what evidence? Satellite photos that show an unusually shaped iceberg? Data readings that only oceanographers would understand? Dreams? George shook his head. We'd sound crazy. He was right. We had nothing concrete to take to authorities, nothing that would convince anyone of the threat. But I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. What about the research team here? I asked. They must have noticed something unusual. They've been documenting the anomalies, but they have no context for what they're seeing. They think it's just an interesting scientific phenomenon. George returned to the computer and pulled up another file. But look at this. They've been recording low-frequency audio from underwater microphones. He clicked play. A deep, rhythmic sound filled the room, not quite a heartbeat, but something organic and pulsing. It made my skin crawl. That's coming from the iceberg? I asked. George nodded. Started 3 days ago, gets stronger every hour. I walked to the windows, looking out at the vast Pacific. Somewhere out there, the thing from my dreams was moving through the dark water, heading toward land, toward people who had no idea what was coming. I need to see it, I said suddenly. Do you have binoculars? George hesitated, then opened a cabinet and handed me a powerful spotting scope. It's still too far out to see with the naked eye, but this might help. There's an observation deck upstairs. I took the scope and headed for the stairs, with George following behind. The observation deck was a small platform surrounded by glass walls that offered a 360-degree view of the ocean and coastline. The wind was stronger here, carrying the scent of salt and seaweed. I pointed the scope toward the open ocean, adjusting the focus. At first, I saw nothing but waves stretching to the horizon. Then a white shape appeared at the edge of my vision, distant but unmistakable against the dark water. What I saw through the lens made my blood run cold. The iceberg was changing even as I watched. Sections of ice were breaking away, not randomly as melting ice would, but in patterns that revealed something underneath. I could make out curved structures that looked like segments of a massive exoskeleton, dark against the white ice that still partially covered them. George, I said, my voice barely audible over the wind, you need to see this. He took the scope from me and looked for himself. His face went pale. It's not melting, he whispered. It's shedding the ice, like a cocoon. As we watched, a section of ice the size of a city block slid away, revealing more of the dark shape beneath. I couldn't make out details at this distance, but the overall impression was of something ancient and utterly alien, part crustacean, part cephalopod, but following no evolutionary path known to Earth. How big is it? I asked. George lowered the scope, his hands shaking slightly. Based on the satellite data, at least a mile across, maybe larger. A mile. The thing I'd glimpsed beneath the ice at Echo 7, the entity that had haunted my dreams for 16 years, was the size of a small city, and it was awake, aware, and heading toward populated coastlines. We need to document everything, I said. Download all the data, take photos, record everything we can. Someone has to believe us." George nodded and handed me the scope again. "I'll get started. Keep watching. We need to know what we're dealing with." He disappeared back down the stairs, leaving me alone with the wind and the distant horror I could barely comprehend. I raised the scope again, forcing myself to look, to witness what was happening. Through the lens, I saw more ice falling away, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath, structures that seemed to pulse and shift, appendages larger than aircraft carriers, surfaces that absorbed light rather than reflected it. It moved with purpose, each motion deliberate and precise. This was no mindless creature acting on instinct. This was intelligence, ancient beyond human understanding, finally free after eons of imprisonment. And somehow, I knew it was aware of being watched. I felt its consciousness brush against my mind, just as it had in my dreams. It knew about us now, about humans, about civilization, about the world we had built while it slept beneath the ice. It was curious, hungry for knowledge and experience. The scope slipped from my suddenly numb fingers, clattering on the deck. I stumbled back from the windows, my heart racing. The contact had lasted only seconds, but it left me gasping, my mind struggling to process what it had touched. I heard George calling from below, his voice urgent. I forced myself to move, to function despite the terror gripping me. I retrieved the scope and headed back downstairs. George was in the main research area, frantically downloading files to external drives. "The satellite feed just updated," he said without looking up. "It's changing course again, heading directly toward the California coastline now." I set the scope down on a desk, my hands still unsteady. "George, it knows we're watching. It touched my mind somehow, just like in the dreams, but stronger." He stopped typing and looked at me. "What did it communicate?" "Nothing specific, just awareness, curiosity." I struggled to put the experience into words. "It's studying us, George, learning about us, and I don't think it sees us as equals." George was silent for a long moment. Then he ejected the drives he'd been filling and handed one to me. "Everything's on here, all the data, images, recordings. Take it somewhere safe. Make copies. Get it to people who might listen." "What about you?" "I'm staying to monitor its progress. Someone needs to track it, to warn coastal communities if it maintains its current course." He met my eyes. "We both know what's at stake here, Andrew. This isn't just about us anymore." I wanted to argue, to insist he come with me, but I knew he was right. We needed someone on the inside, someone with access to the scientific equipment that could track the entity's movements. "I'll get this information out," I promised, pocketing the drive, "and I'll find a way to make people believe it." George nodded, then turned back to his computer. "You should go now. If they're monitoring this facility, they'll notice the data downloads soon." I hesitated, not wanting to leave him alone, but knowing I had no choice. "Stay safe, George, and stay in touch." "I'll try." He didn't look up from his screen. "But if you don't hear from me, I'll know what happened," I finished for him. I took one last look around the quiet research station, at the monitors showing the thing that was slowly revealing itself in the distant ocean. Then I headed for the door, the weight of the knowledge I carried feeling heavier than any pack I'd shouldered in my military days. As I drove away from the observation station, I glanced in my rearview mirror at the vast Pacific stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, an ancient entity was awakening fully, shedding its icy prison and turning its attention to the world of humans. Everything was about to change. I've written this account as faithfully as I can, recording what I witnessed and experienced. By the time you read these words, the truth will likely be impossible to hide. The creature from beneath the Antarctic ice has returned to a world that never knew it existed, and humanity's understanding of our place in that world will never be the same.